and then we'll get started. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Sheila Caldwell, Southern Illinois University System Vice President for Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as the Chief Diversity Officer. Today, I would like to welcome you to our conversation of understanding our collective responsibility, confronting and counteracting anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Anti-DEI legislation has been introduced in over 34 states and have passed in 8 states. Those particular states are Florida, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Legislation passed has banned diversity, equity, and inclusion training, prohibited colleges from offering training, and also removed DEI team members from higher education. Today, I'm excited that we have diversity, equity, and inclusion experts who will share their insights, experiences, and ideas for combating legislation that hinders DEI in our everyday work. Thank you for participating in this meaningful discussion. I would also like to acknowledge our fearless president, Dr. Dan Mahoney, for his continued support and for joining us today. I also want to thank Project Coordinator Doris Williams, who will receive your questions. Again, this is a great opportunity to ask the experts. So I would highly encourage you, if you're joining us on YouTube today, to put your questions in the chat. And then last but not least, we have Mr. Carol Walker, who is providing technical leadership. For those of you who know people who are interested in this conversation who may miss it today, please let them know probably within 10 minutes that this conversation concludes. It will be on the SIU System YouTube channel, okay? So again, I wanna thank our experts who have gathered today, and I would like to start out in alphabetical order by introducing Dr. Harrison Davis, who is the Chief Diversity Officer and Director for Life University in the state of Georgia. Next, we have attorney Andrea Dees, who is the Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion for Minnesota State Colleges and Universities. And last but not least, again, we have our attorney, Mr. Dwayne Morgan, who is the Senior Director of Education, Outreach, and the Pipeline Development at the University System of Maryland. So we have Maryland, Minnesota, as well as Georgia, who will be sharing insights today. And I also want to thank everyone who's joined us for YouTube. And as one last reminder, please make sure you send your questions to our host, Ms. Doris Williams. So now we're going to dive in with our very first question, who I'm going to direct to Dr. Andrea Dees. If you can tell us, what is anti-DEI legislation from your perspective? How would you define it?
Thank you, Dr. Caldwell, and thank you for the opportunity to have this very important and timely discussion at this time. When we think about the anti-DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion legislation, it's a very calculated movement, mainly by state legislators, to diminish and or abolish DEI offices, curriculum, training, and other processes that are specifically targeted toward state public higher education institutions. And as you had mentioned at the forefront, there are over, like you said, 34 states that have had in some form or fashion these last couple of years some type of legislation that's been brought, including in the state of Minnesota. I will note, luckily nothing got moved forward, but it's clearly a movement that actually really started even before state legislatures got involved, with the former administration specifically talking about and making sure that there were some potential bans around just diversity training in and of itself as part of a federal movement. So all of this has been really building up over time. We're just kind of now seeing it come to fruition, but don't take any mistakes. This has been a long time coming.
Wow, yeah, you're exactly right. And so it's interesting, like you said, you're one of those states where it hasn't passed, but you've also felt, in the climate, the desire to see this legislation banned. And now I would like to ask Dwayne, if you could just tell us what are the areas that concern you most as we look at anti-DEI legislation? What kind of keeps you up at night?
Well, and thank you, Dr. Caldwell, for this invitation to be with you and your community. I'm looking forward to this discussion. And I do come to you from Maryland, which on the surface, of course, Maryland is more on the liberal side of states if you're thinking about legislation. So while we don't have any of these types of legislation on our books, or no one's really seriously putting these forward, I am sensitive to the effects of this movement towards legislation around the nation. And I think that one of the things, well, there are a couple of things that really keep me up at night, and honestly, keep me up. Um, and its potential effect on faculty, our ability to attract smart, talented people into the spaces that frankly need them most. If you think about the places that have enacted some of this legislation, these are places that need uh, these uh, these faculty would be um, both in terms of teaching the types of curriculum that would sort of embrace all of America's history, including the dark and ugly parts that we don't like to talk about, uh, and acknowledge those, but also in terms of leadership on our institutions. Like the reality is we need leaders who have a diverse set of backgrounds, who understand the world from a very sort of diverse set of experiences. And so I'm really concerned that this type of legislation will have a chilling effect for faculty and recruiting them into um, into the academy. And I think that the effect could sort of spill over into some of our more liberal states. And also, but more importantly, I'm concerned and really uh, uh, you know I'm thinking about the students who are in these classes. I'm thinking about the Black, Brown students who um, see this happening around them, and how they must feel about going to school at a public institution in one of these states. Um, I'll just divulge that I am an alumni of the University of Florida, twice over, actually, for undergrad and grad school. I went to the University of Florida, which in itself has a very not so pleasant history with regard to uh, segregation and in efforts to not desegregate. And in fact, I went to law school under a scholarship that, with this present um, set of legislation, would not exist. It was actually a scholarship named for Virgil Hawkins, who was the African American who, if you will, desegregated the University of Florida. And so um, I think that the faculty and the students are who I'm really, really concerned about. Um, you know, I will over time we'll talk more about this, but I think the chilling effect for faculty and then those students who are sort of experiencing this in real time, I'm really concerned for.
So if
Thank
I could just jump in right quick with that, we're talking about concerns um, about anti-DEI policies and legislation. And Andrielle mentioned something earlier about how this all started to the current campaign, and that was under former President Trump, who demonized diversity, equity, and inclusion by indicating he thought it was unfair. And he signed an executive order eliminating diversity training at all federal levels. So when I look at it from a larger scale, wide angle, my biggest concern, in addition to the students, faculty, and staff, is the fact that all of a sudden diversity is a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like something from the devil. And equity and being fair is something that's not desired. And that is moving the country into a direction that undermines a lot of the things that's written into our Constitution. Now we take it down to the micro level to a university and we see how it plays out. We see how it affects some of those students, the brown, Black students, and LGBT students who are out there, and how they feel welcome and their performance on campus. So that's what keeps me up at night, not only at the university, but the direction of the country, where all of a sudden fairness is something that is a bad word and you can be penalized. by demonstrating fairness.
No, you make an excellent point. We were listening, and other states are outlawing the word belonging, which is amazing, as well as not wanting to use the word minority anymore, which obviously was a descriptor created to designate us into certain circles and marginalization in society. So yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling. So I appreciate you highlighting the concerns with just words that are really good words are being demonized and twisted, right, and have this false narrative. Andrea, are some things that you're concerned about that also keep you up at night as well?
Oh my. Well, I think I think my colleagues really touched on, I think the main things that I would agree with in totality. I think that the one thing that I'll note is, in Minnesota, while we sometimes feel like we are a bit of an island because as you mentioned, North Dakota and South Dakota have legislation that has passed. What's interesting is Wisconsin has not, but they have utilized a different route of which to diminish the work around DEI by, quite frankly, diminishing resources to the flagship and to the system overall. Or at least having that attempt to try to do that. I don't think that they were successful. And in fact, I know they weren't successful. But it's very interesting to think about the policy implications. And these are the things that I think would keep me up at night are not necessarily the things that we know about, but the things that we are not quite aware of that we probably need to take a proactive stance on in terms of understanding the different policy processes that occur outside of the legislative process in and of itself. There's so many administrative processes that occur that are within the confines of those that have the ability to still try to effectuate and diminish the work in different ways. So I think that's something that I am trying to get a broader understanding around and also help my colleagues here at Minnesota State and other institutions of the state of Minnesota to make sure that we're aware of what is really happening around us and that we're not we're probably one legislator away from something like that happening because it's no state I think is completely out of the picture of potentially having something like that happen to them. So just having that awareness.
Yeah, no, and I agree, and I'm happy we have DEI leaders from all different sectors, but I think this is really important that we have attorneys who specifically do this work because again, these things are going through law, and as you said, it's really important that we understand how these laws get passed, what the policies are, because we know as we've done this work that it could take, months and years, a lot of times years to get things on track. So just to be able to imagine within the past year and a half, we've had really the majority of states, we have 50 states and we have 34 states who have even considered introducing this type of legislation. And to think about all the work that has been undone with efforts, even civil rights prior to that, it is very concerning. We are definitely we're at a precipice, right, in society right now.
Yeah. And could I think that that's actually very important because of the broader context and the broader effects of it. If you think about sort of the civic duty, civic opportunity that, again, higher education affords, and sort of the interpretation of legislation at the state level and how that actually relates to, again, releasing or removing opportunities from groups. And you look at some of the states that have, while they are also doing the DEI work, they actually want to disenfranchise, voters. And so it's actually part of a larger like
campaign.
context. Like the fact is that they don't want to have voting that is representative of the entire state of, the people who are living there. And so this is all part of the same narrative, I think. And I think we should actually think about that as we engage in the conversation, because once you have truly disenfranchised people from voting and being part of the sort of the mechanism, you've succeeded in sort of eliminating that voice and from consideration. And I think that's sort of the long-term danger here that I see as well. It's like, not only, this is not just about 2023 and 2024. This has implications for us for a long, long time if we don't sort of fight back and sort of re-energize voting, civic engagement, community connections to that enterprise. So
that's excellent. Yeah, you're right. You think about states, abortion, right? Similar states have banned that, as well as, like you said, voting rights. So it is a larger context. It's rights collectively and not just this one singular focus. So I appreciate you speaking to that. And Dr. Davis, if you can, as we talk about these states, and so many have banned it, why do you think 34 states have introduced or banned diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Now that's a loaded question right there. And it might take a long time to answer. I can offer you my theory that's behind it. Dwayne Morgan touched on it just a little bit about a larger context or campaign that is out there. But the purpose behind some of these policies, a lot of times, is politics, is votes. It's trying to get votes so that certain politicians can move forward with their own agenda. And what they've been a little bit successful at doing is motivating that voter base, by creating another enemy. This is just another strategy that's been employed before in the past. So identifying a certain voter base, helping them to understand there's this enemy out there that is affecting you in a negative way. It's unfortunate that that enemy happens to be DEI. And the fact that there are resources for certain students and faculty and staff to attract and ensure student success and improve graduation rates. And somehow they've been very successful at creating that narrative and continuing that narrative and convincing certain people that that is not good for you. And that if you vote for me, I'm going to stop these individuals and these universities from doing the things that impact you so that you can advance. And it's unfortunate they've created this environment where they're convincing people that only one or two people can advance, can improve. Everybody cannot come along. So here's my plan to cut out these individuals here. But if you vote for me, I'll make sure that that happens. And they tie into that. You don't want your kids or your grandkids learning about these things from our history. We don't want them to believe that something bad has happened to these other individuals, and we should have empathy for them and help them to achieve some of their goals, or perhaps some level of responsibility and helping these other individuals achieve their goals. So that's a loaded question, but power and politics are ultimately behind it, and it's affecting how universities are run and ultimately the product that they're putting out. And that those are the individuals who are eventually graduating and who has an opportunity to graduate and be successful at that university.
No, absolutely. And I'm actually going to chime in. I think another thing that we haven't explored, that I've experienced firsthand at a liberal arts college I was at, is that oftentimes in K through 12, they have a very varnished tale of what they teach students. They don't give them a full truth. And really, higher education and the 4-year experience is really one of the first times that students get a much more broader context of what really happened.
Exposure.
Exposure, exactly. And so, because many of them are underexposed when they come to our campuses. And so what happens when those students acquire that knowledge, and they go back for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they're having these type of conversations with their parents, it really can create a rift. And I think that that's part of it. Parents are having these students who have this light bulb moment and this awareness, and they really want them to kind of stay in the dark. I think about how it is like when you use the word evil, it's like evil has occurred and people need to know about that. And what does it look like to want people to not be able to discern that type of evil, and also to acknowledge the progress that America has made. So to me, it's like one of the terms I use is that, do we really want a nation of fools, right? Who don't really understand what really happened in history. And again, to be able to discern the difference between good and evil, and to celebrate and acknowledge that we still have a lot further to go. So that's also one of my concerns. But I do think that that's a real issue, is that those relationships have been impacted and sometimes severed because students have learned things that they were never taught in the home as well as in the K-12 environment.
Absolutely, Sheila, you're right on target with that. Those parents are now looking at their kids coming home from college after they've been exposed to some realities and learning something new. And now the parents are going, no, those are not our values.
Right.
No, you can't have empathy for these other people. You need to focus on us. And so that's what a lot of the politicians have tapped into, and convincing those parents who are going to eventually convince their kids that you
Yes.
need to shift this way so that your future can be prosperous, because it cannot be prosperous if these other people are going to come along with you. So that's a very important point, and the politicians have tapped into that fear.
Yeah, the fear and also the scarcity mindset, right? Yeah. So, I would kind of like to follow up that question. We've talked about 34 states. I mean, that's obviously concerning that it's been introduced, but it is worth noting. I mentioned earlier that eight states have passed anti-DI legislation, but I just thought about the update. Iowa, we need to add to that list. It's been over the past month. I don't think it's been circulated a lot in the news, but Iowa is also a state has now banned some DEI legislation. So, Andrew, if you can actually talk about that, why do you think so many states have not been as successful in securing legislation to harm DEI in colleges and across the nation?
Well, you just like hit the nail on the head. I mean, when I said we're an island, we're an island. I mean, those are all of the surrounding states that are in the upper Midwest, and that have had some success, even if it's modest success. And it's very interesting to note that the continuum of the types of legislation that have occurred that have passed. It's been very interesting to see, the thought process of going from maybe going into a specific area, maybe focusing more on the human resource side in terms of how you're hiring and looking at hiring practices, has been very interesting. I think North Carolina definitely went in that direction, and other states have done that as well. But they've been very, very careful to not go too far. Which is very interesting. The Manhattan Institute, which is and they are very vocal. They are the ones that have created the model legislation template for states that may have an interest in moving forward in this way. They have very much said that they specifically did not want to go so far as to push the envelope whereby they would be subject to some type of litigation. Really basically saying that these types of legislative bills would not fly in the face of federal discrimination laws, either under Title VI, Title VII, and other, but mainly Title VI is the main piece that they've looked at. And so it's been really interesting to see how the different states have responded. Some have, like I said, have gone in terms of, have gone so far as to say curriculum, everything gone. And others have been more, and they're taking the temperature, obviously, of what they can and cannot move forward in their particular state. So it's one of the things that, and I appreciate getting this resource. Dwayne, I don't know if you want to talk about the tracker that is actually out there that allows for people to really follow the different types of legislation that have been put out there in the different states. But that's important for us to understand too, because it gives you a full understanding of the continuum. So those that have had successful efforts and those that have successfully prevented, really, I think the ones that have prevented probably just did not take the temperature of their state and really look at how far can we take this? It's not that they don't have the ideology. It's where do you find those opportunities to really gather the in state legislatures. It's more about the votes and the will of the I would say the loud people because there's a lot of folks that aren't paying attention to this and won't see the effects of this until it actually affects them. And I think that that's something where we have to be thoughtful and cognizant of too, is I'm happy to talk about this a little later, but we've got to reshape and re-own the narrative of this work. We cannot allow for those that are attempting to shape the narrative in a different way to basically own that and be the squeaky wheels, for lack of a better term, in this work.
No, absolutely. And I just want to interject and just reinforce what you just said. So as we talk about how do we combat or counteract anti-DEI policies, and like you said, it's a false and incomplete narrative, and we have to really speak about the good work that we have done in diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically even listening to Harrison earlier when you talked about how we're helping students retain and graduate and also offering them really a safe haven oftentimes. So that is the work that we're doing, and we need to make sure that we augment and celebrate that more. Harrison, by you being in Georgia, can you tell us a little bit more about legislation and how that's manifested in your state?
Gotcha. So as Andrea was talking about, there are different approaches that state legislators are taking to attack DEI programs, but some of the states are not falling for it. And one of the things that I've seen with some of those states, the legislators are questioning the funding and the effectiveness of DEI programs. So they're making the universities justify the funding for the DEI programs. And what some of the universities and the systems have done have actually shown that the DEI programs are beneficial, not with just the students of color, but with all the students and exposing all the students to diversity and improving retention rates, and attracting more students who will contribute to the fabric of the university. So there's a lot of evidence and research out there to show that the DEI programs really do work, and that information went right back to the legislators and they couldn't tackle it from that standpoint. So that's something that we can certainly do to try to combat, some of these legislative attacks on us. The programs work, and they've improved retention rates. They've improved graduation rates. We have retained a more diverse faculty base, so those things actually work. But in Georgia, like many other states, they found a new way, to attack DEI programs in the university system. Instead of introducing a law, through the state legislators, they basically Lieutenant Governor pressured the university system of Georgia to justify some of the funding, and then afterwards, the university system decided to modify the employee handbook and change some of the policies that do not require a vote, do not require the governor's signature on anything. So they were mild changes that were placed in there, but we can no longer request or require a diversity statement for applicants for jobs. And all of these policies affect employees, faculty, and staff, not the students, because that's where I believe a lot of these individuals saw the biggest uproar. In other states, people were up in arms because you're taking resources from the students. But now in certain states like Georgia, they're just telling the employees, you can't do this. You cannot offer this type of training to faculty and staff. We must approve this training. And you cannot have a diversity statement, and you cannot require applicants to talk about that. And so that has been a new approach that some states have taken, and Georgia has one of them that was very successful with it. And that employee handbook is out there, and every employee has to sign it, that they read it, they understand it. And so if you violate those rules, your job is in jeopardy. So that's just one step and one strategy that certain states are taking to avoid the media hoopla that comes with it. So that's what I know about it.
Okay. And I just wanted to follow up before I get to Dwayne and talk about the tracker. So as we talk about like why states have banned this, and I specifically appreciate you talking about Georgia, you know, some of the words that have went is like, oh, DI is divisive, right? Like we're dividing when really in our descriptions, we specifically talk about how to unify campuses. So again, that's a false and incomplete narrative. Another word that I've heard very common is indoctrination as well. And I'm actually going to, and I'm going to ask Ms. Williams, if she can copy this link that I just put in and share it with the SIU YouTube. Our president, Dan Mahoney, actually did an article that is featured in Inside Higher Ed about the myth of indoctrination. And I bring up that word indoctrination, Harrison, because I think that specifically in the legislation is that you all cannot indoctrinate. I think that's part of your employee policy. You all have to sign a statement in Georgia saying that you will not indoctrinate. And I think that's very interesting. Yeah, Dr. Mahoney, do you want to talk a little bit? I'm just going to have you jump in and just maybe share some highlights from your thoughts about the myth of indoctrination from your article.
Yeah, no, and what I talked about in the article is basically it just how, frankly, impossible it is for us to indoctrinate students as faculty members. We don't have enough time. They're exposed to so many other pieces of information. And frankly, they're much, much more influenced by their peers. And in fact, I think even when you talk about those conversations they have at Thanksgiving, sometimes it's as much what they learned in class, but sometimes it's even more so what they've learned by being exposed to different people in college. And certainly I had that experience as well of being exposed to a whole new group of people, and you learn a lot from them. But we actually don't indoctrinate. We don't try to indoctrinate. And even if we did, it would really be impossible for us to do for a whole host of reasons. But that word tends to be very effective because it sounds very scary. It sounds cult-like, and it sounds like we're actually doing something that would be seen, frankly, pretty negatively in most contexts. And so they use the word specifically. I always talk about word choice is important. That word is used specifically because it scares people. And I think it goes beyond even the families of those students. Everybody else hears that too. So even those who have no kids in school will still feel like universities are indoctrinating people. And really, we're exposing them to new ideas, but it's very different exposing someone to a new idea and actually forcing them to believe, which I also talk about. I'm not sure how I'd force anybody to believe anything. I certainly have never been able to do that. I will say it was funny. One of the responses I got back from a few faculty members who read it was, you know, I can't even get my students to read their syllabus. How am I going to indoctrinate them? Like, this is not something we're really capable of doing. We have bigger challenges to focus on. But anyways, I think that's really what I focused on. But again, it clearly has been used very effectively. And in fact, I've even heard some university presidents talking about we need to stop indoctrinating students, which I find frightening.
No, yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's a good read. I just want to encourage, and I think I was really grateful as we talk about not having the conversations to have a college president actually talk about how ridiculous it is, really the notion that we really have the power to alter, you know, how people think within, you know, you think about how much time professors even have with their students. It's really highly unlikely. So I appreciate that opinion. And I also appreciate you sharing, you know, when you were talking about words that are scary, it made me think about Lee Atwater, how he talked about you won't even know what we're talking about, you know, dog whistle politics. And I think that we have to be really mindful of how people are very strategic with using words that they know will have a certain impact on the public discourse, and also sway how people vote and even offer opinions about the work that we're doing, even though a lot of times it's completely false. So I think that's also something I just wanted to reiterate. Before we hop on to other questions, Dwayne, can you maybe just share a little bit about the tracker for those people who are actually listening in today? I always say, don't take our word for it because we don't want to indoctrinate, right? So we want to make sure that you all can have this information yourself. So can you talk a little bit about the tracker that people can use to monitor this legislation?
Sure, and I'll put the address in the chat here, and then you can share it on YouTube. But the Education Trust, which is an organization here in Washington, D.C., they've been around for decades now. They have developed a tracker, basically that examines the anti-DEI efforts at colleges and universities across the nation. They look at proposed legislation, legislation that passed, that did not pass. And so, but this is a constant sort of updating that they'll be doing as we begin new legislative sessions in the next few weeks. They'll be basically tracking all of the 50 United States and District of Columbia to look at legislation and specifically around anti-DEI at our colleges and universities, and in general too, but specifically they're looking at from the education perspective. What are those dangerous sets of anti-DEI legislation that's sort of on the horizon, and the status of that legislation.
Thank
Yeah,
you so much for that resource. Oh, Dr. Davis.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, yeah, those trackers are so important, just to understand the reality of it so that we're informed,
Right.
instead of listening to other people with their own personal ideas about it. You can just go to one of those trackers there, and there are several out there that let you know what your state is attempting to do, and to realize how oppressive some of those other legislative events have taken on some of the states. And I'm thinking specifically about Texas, and how those individuals, chief diversity officers, lost their jobs,
Right.
when the governor signed that legislation, and they're forbidden from using the term diversity, equity, inclusion. You cannot include that in a syllabus. You cannot stake that out into the campus public environment. And so it's some real oppressive policies that are out there, and those trackers help us to understand what are the trends. And I believe also there are some politicians who are using those trackers to realize what's working and what is
what's not
working.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's wise for us to stay informed.
Oh, yeah.
And Andriel mentioned the fact that Minnesota is an island. I think that really seeing this anti-DEI work geographically on a map, it adds another layer of sort of reality. And also for those states who are without any of the coloring as of yet, I'm knocking on wood here, really thinking about how do we, as allies, as supporters of our colleagues in these other states, how do we show up for them in real tangible ways? Because it is, as Dr. Davis just mentioned, people literally losing their livelihood.
Yes.
And it's important for us who are in a space where we are not necessarily attacked in the same way to really be there in real ways for our colleagues around the nation.
No, I appreciate that. And for those states that we mentioned, we do stand in solidarity with you. And I think that it's also worth saying that you can reach out to us and we will be willing to do whatever we can to help. I think as I've been listening to the conversation, I think another thing that I want to point out about how this DI legislation is affecting the nation. Like I spoke to someone who is now in Illinois doing this work, who was specifically in Texas. And she said the week after she left, you would have thought she was never there. They literally scrubbed the entire website. So what does that look like from a historical perspective, that this person was there for years, did all of this work, and there was absolutely no trace of her or the evidence of the fruit of the labor that she had contributed to the university. So I think that's another issue when we talk about rewriting history and only offering certain narratives. That's another thing. So I like to use the term erase, because that's what's happening when we really think about what does it mean when someone's against diversity. So you're against representation. I mean, this country was built. That's part of in our founding documents, the word representation. That's simply what diversity means. So what does it look like? You don't want diverse people? I mean, we have to ask these questions. Equity. At SIU, we defined it as act right, make right, do right. It's really a term. It's actually a judicial term. It's a term that's used in the Bible. It just really means to act right and to be righteous, right?
Yeah.
So how can you be against that? Inclusion, people deserving to show up as their full selves, to be authentic and have a seat at the table. How could you be against any of those terms? So when we talk about banning DEI, you're banning representation, you're banning righteousness, right? Because I'm going to use that word. And inclusion, you're banning people's ability to be authentic and to really contribute to society in a meaningful way. And I think that needs to be said. So we should be all concerned. It shouldn't just be people of color. Everybody should be concerned about what's happening in our states, and we should monitor it, and we should be very mindful of, I would say, schemes and nefarious words that they use to basically deceive people about what's really happening. We have to be diligent and do our homework and not be led astray, I would say, by politicians and people, again, who have their own agenda. So I just wanted to mention that as well. So we have a few more questions that we're going to get to. And I think for all of those who are joining us on YouTube, we're going to get to you in a minute. So please keep those questions coming. We've talked about a lot of issues as it relates to, DEI and the ban on the legislation. Harrison, if you could tell us, how do you address legislation that infringes upon individuals' freedom of speech and expression by regulating conversations about sensitive topics? Like you said in Georgia, I've looked at legislations that say specifically you can't have social discourse. You can't, they don't want diversity of opinions. I mean, that is specifically in the legislation. I would encourage you all to read that. So what are your thoughts about that as we talk about freedom of speech, freedom of expression? How will that be hindered as a result of this ban?
Yeah, all of that falls under the umbrella of academic freedom and going into the classroom and talking about whatever you want to talk about, your opinions, and the faculty, staff, and students. You have the right to disagree, with the instructor, the professor, or even with your colleagues, and have some type of freedom of your pedagogical skills, with you presenting the information, So I thought all of that was endorsed, by everyone. But now, when we're informing some of our colleagues about unfair communication, unfair information, and whether or not they are personally attacking individuals, particularly the students and their cultural background. These students pay thousands of dollars, to go to school and to class, and they take out loans or their parents are paying for it. And some students are sitting there being insulted, by the instructor by pushing some false narrative that's out there and convincing the other students of something that's not true. They're all paying the same thing. Now, when we come forward, some of us come forward and try to train and educate, perhaps there's a different approach you can take. I'm not attacking you and your ability to express yourself or your ideas, but can we allow the other people to express their ideas as well? And also, I want you to think about assessing the impact of some of those statements. We're all here to educate the students and for them to reach their goals. Why must we attack who they are or minimize who they are in their culture in order for you to stand there with a great deal of power, and try to convince people of this philosophy that you have? So all of that is under academic freedom, and I'm surprised about how things have been twisted. And people are justifying insulting students, and making some students feel uncomfortable or taking away their voice when they're paying the same thing as the other students. So I go in to do a lot of trainings, sometimes with faculty, to help them to understand cultural competence or even basic listening, active listening skills, and thinking about how your words and communication can be perceived by other people. And if someone doesn't like it, what you said or what you're trying to convince them, instead of attacking them, why don't you listen to the opposite opinion and understand that we all come from diverse cultural backgrounds? We can include that information in the classroom. We can enrich the educational process by having everybody have a voice. So that's my stake on that, and really surprised about how people have used academic freedom and freedom of expression to attack DEI and justifying some of the things that they're doing.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think that is the operative word, that freedom of expression and freedom of speech is being attacked with this legislation. And then again, if people pay close attention to what is written in those different states, we'll see that that's actually true. So again, I would encourage and implore people to do that. And now I'm going to go to Attorney Diaz. Do you foresee any potential effects on the achievement of learning outcomes? Again, we exist to serve our students, to teach our students, to make sure they have critical thinking skills. So what exactly do you think this will do to empathy, cultural competency, as we just heard, critical thinking skills?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And, I'm just going to pick up really where Harrison left off. I think that there are going to be debilitating effects, both inside and outside of the classroom. When we think about the whole learning continuum for the student, the opportunity for civil discourse, I mean, the table needs to be set for that. And unfortunately, we have not set the table for that. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's very, very difficult for for not just professors, but even students when they're trying to connect either with talk through very interesting and a variety of topics. You can't even really have those kind of differing discussions anymore because we've become so divisive and defensive in the way that people take statements that may not be within their perspective of what they consider their values. And as an example, years ago when I was teaching and I'm in a dean at a law school here in Minnesota, we had a great opportunity and this was really brought by the students. I love the organic process of having students come forth and say, one organization that actually the Black Law Students Association said, we want to talk with the Federalist Society about different topics ranging from, police brutality to housing to employment. And, my mouth just dropped. Okay, let's do this. And it was great because they set the table themselves for the opportunity to have that type of civil discourse, bringing in people that may have differing opinions about how the process of those topics may have an impact from a social perspective, but willing to listen to each other and engage in really strong listening skills so that we may learn from each other. And I think what we're seeing now is that has been taken away with a lot of these very prescriptive, very prescriptive ways of how a person can interact within the classroom, which ultimately spills over into the way that people see and interact with each other outside of the classroom. So it really has put, I think, a very intentional hush on the way that higher education is able to really embrace what the core tenets of what higher education is about expanding our perspectives, expanding our horizons, and understanding not just technical knowledge, but innate knowledge about who we are and how we interact with each other. So it's just if we continue to go down this road, I think we're really going to find ourselves in a very sad state of affairs when it comes to really being able to put out and encourage broader, more critical thinking skills.
I wholeheartedly agree. Yeah, and as you were speaking, it's like what is lost, and I think the students, as we have these conversations, they're going to really be the ones that suffer. Because again, when you're making the conversation a minefield, right? And I heard you and Harrison speak repeatedly about the operative word listening, right? We have to be willing to listen. And if you can't have the conversations and if you can't even express curiosity, how are you going to learn, right? So, and I think that is the concern.
And it's unfortunate, what Andriel is talking about on college campuses, instead of professors engaging in organic conversations, there's an agenda there, that's prohibiting people from learning and being exposed to new ideas. And then when they ask questions about it, they're attacked sometimes or minimized. That is truly unfortunate, and that will hurt us in the end.
Absolutely. And Dr. Harris, I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to go to Attorney Morgan. If we could just speak about, given the increasing diversity in the workforce, how important is it for higher education institutions to prepare students for navigating diverse and inclusive work environments? And how might anti-DEI legislation influence this preparation? So now our students are with us 4 to 6 years. We release them into society. How will this impact them as they go into the workforce?
Well, I could talk on that first. I just came from a diversity summit through the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. And so these were non-education people. These were business leaders throughout the state. and a lot of their diversity officers, and they talked about the need to diversify the workforce and the benefits of a diverse workforce, you know, because many of the customers are diverse with the product and services that they're selling, and you need to be able to communicate and engage and relate to those customers if you're going to sell something. The best way to do that is to have a diverse workforce. So they were really questioning, you know, the job that many universities are doing, not only in with the graduating a diverse workforce, but the multicultural engagement skills that some of the graduates have, because that's going to eventually hurt the bottom line, you know, with some of these industries that are out there, and they're looking for people who can communicate with different people and relate to different people, because that's how they sell their products and services. And so there's a real concern about these legislations that are out there and they're being passed, and the impact on the quality of the worker, you know, and the effectiveness of the worker, and how they're going to be able to walk into a new environment and be part of that culture that embraces diversity and harnesses diversity and inclusion and uses that to help the bottom line with their employees. So everybody benefits from DEI. Now, when you pull back and look at what the universities are doing, that's interfering with some of those economic goals that some of the businesses have. You know, I didn't hear one business leader talk about they only want to sell to a certain customer. They talked about widening out the customer base. And one way to do that is to have a diverse group of people to go out there and talk to their customers and sell their products. Now it's up to us, the universities, to ensure that we graduate a diverse workforce and people who can engage with people from different multicultural environments.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. And I just want to say, I think as we talk about how do we combat, we heard Attorney Dees earlier specifically say, making sure that we kind of own the narrative again. But I think also, again, Dr. Davis's suggestion that we include the workforce, because I don't think that they probably are aware of this legislation and what's going on. But again, our students are going to leave us and they're going to go directly to them. And I think it's worth saying that a lot of this legislation has banned DEI training. So where are the students in these states going to get DEI training to learn about cultural competencies, to learn about how they could develop themselves with different individuals, to have those conversations so that they can be prepared when they go into the workforce? So it's dire. It's going to be dire consequences as we continue this. Attorney Morgan, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I will just echo what Dr. Davis said, and then again point the light back on us as higher education advocates and professionals, and really, you know, and not abdicating our duty and the opportunity that's before us. Higher education is the space where we model, we teach how to have difficult conversations, how to, you know, how do you consider a diverse set of ideas? How do you make sense out of a world that might be more complex than one would want? All of these are critical to having a healthy sort of workforce, but also having a healthy sort of, you know, community at large. I think that it's not just making sure that, you know, once they're on that job and they can actually operate and make widgets or what have you, but it really is, how do you create a life that honors who you are, who your own identity, while also acknowledging that there are other identities out there that are not your identity, but those identities are just as valid. And I think that the challenge with much of this anti-DEI legislation is that it presents some universities with this notion of having to choose whether or not to abdicate that responsibility of teaching students how to make sense out of a diverse world. And I think that that's a huge, it's a huge loss, not only for the students, for the institution, for the community, that whether they accept it or not, they need those universities to be that center of sort of, thought, to be that place where we can challenge each other and debate. And sometimes these debates are about diversity. Sometimes they're about equity. Sometimes they're about justice. Like, these are important aspects of life. And I think that as a higher education community, this is a space that we need to really reevaluate our own sort of role in this, individually and also institutionally as well. So really challenge ourselves to be better in this space, so that we ensure that we are indeed those safe spaces for those types of conversations and that learning, so that when they are transitioning into that workforce, that they are successful, and then in turn can actually give back to the university through those checks. So I think that really accepting and reaffirming, I think we need maybe a collective reaffirming among our higher education community about why we do what we do, and really solving those difficult problems, the difficult issues that are before us. That's why we are university.
No, absolutely. Yeah, we just heard our third strategy from Dwayne, as far as, like you said, coming together collectively and affirming why we do the work we do. I think that's another way that we can combat it. But also, as you were talking, I was just thinking, like, we have to consider time and place as far as why this legislation is being introduced. And if we look at a lot of the states that have introduced this legislation, they are very diverse. And not only are they very diverse, I mean, they also have a population that for years now have been majority minority. So I think that's also interesting for this time to say, we're not going to have these conversations. We're going to stop training. We're going to basically decrease some of the critical thinking skills that we have at a time when, as more students are becoming, we're becoming a majority minority nation. It's even more important that we are able to talk to each other and to understand each other. And again, this legislation is prohibiting some of that from happening. One more question before we get to our YouTube people who are watching today, our SIU community and others who have joined. Again, we're very grateful to you, and we will be answering your questions after this final question. As we've talked about a lot of the challenges, I want to know how specifically are your colleges responding, to these bans? Like, what are you doing proactively? What are you doing in some ways reactively? As we look across the nation? I know Dwayne mentioned the map. I look at the map, it's very disorienting to see the color codes and to see all the states that have even introduced the legislation. It says a lot about the direction that this country is going into, and also the direction that higher ed is actually going into as well. So I would like to know, how are your colleges confronting this? Andrea?
Yeah, so one of the things I think at the very beginning that we discussed was, even if legislation is not in your state, just being thoughtful and being in solidarity with colleagues that are being affected by that are being affected by the work that has been in those other states. But knowing that, also thinking about what are those areas that we can strengthen. So for example, here in Minnesota State, I took it upon myself to say, what, we're gonna strengthen our compliance arm. Because one thing they're not gonna deal with is I have a compliance arm that requires us to do certain things because it's the law, and we're making sure that discrimination is still illegal here in the not just in the state of Minnesota, but in the country. So let's make sure that we are increasing a presence of understanding that, well, while there are a lot of areas of gray, there are some areas that are very clear in terms of being able to effectuate and ensure that students, faculty, and staff know that they still have rights and and we have the responsibilities. And what's interesting is that much of the work is anchored in the past acts of discrimination. And so, when we think about the evolution of this work as it has come over the last 50, 60 years, what we've seen is that this was a result of actually when at a point in time when when African Americans could not even go to a public higher education institution, where there were where we were not able to attend because at that time discrimination was the law. They could actually make those discriminatory mandates. It's not the law anymore, and we're hoping that we don't move back into that. We are starting to see some of that, and I'm glad. I know we didn't talk about the affirmative action work because I know we've talked about that. That has occurred over this last year with the ban, the narrow ban on admission. But suffice it to say that we are in a very, very difficult space. So we have to make sure that our strength in understanding what our responsibilities are, supporting our students and our faculty and staff, particularly our faculty and staff of color and other marginalized communities that are feeling those effects, and knowing that they have a space to come to and to go to ensure that their rights are not being debilitated in certain areas. So that's one of the things that we've done. The other thing I will say is that the diversity officers in our system, we are very, very connected and committed to continue to work towards ensuring that DEI doesn't fall off, that we ensure that we are thinking about what are the narratives that we have to re-own within this space. And that the term, and I love what President Mahoney said, that words matter, words do matter. And so ensuring that we have those inclusive guides that truly talk about ways that this work is not being divisive, it's being inclusive. And so making sure that we have those areas, and that's all under our umbrella around our Equity 2030 work, which is really geared at addressing how to eliminate the gaps that still do exist, regardless of all that's going on with this legislation. We still have gaps. We still have gaps based on race, and based on socioeconomic status, based on first generation. There are still education gaps. We have to own that as well, and we have to continue to do the work.
Thank you for that reality check, and also for giving us practical ways that we can really reflect at our institution to be proactive. Thank you for that. Dwayne or Harrison, how are your colleges handling the ban?
So, I mean, I'll tell you, at the system, at our office, we had this discussion. And sometimes you just have to chuckle, and there's a certain amount of because it's so, otherwise you're like filled with tears. But what we're doing, honestly, is where we can recruit and know that for many of these locations, we want people who are in these situations to know that they can come to Maryland. I mean, that's a very real approach, but what we want them to know that this is a place that welcomes all of their identity, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender preference, sexual orientation. Like, we want all of you in Maryland. So, that's part of our, my USM hat. But I was watching a TED Talk by Curtis Blow, who's a journalist, and he was talking about the whole notion of reverse migration. And he was talking about it in terms of, the Great Migration, of course, where a lot of the Black moved from the South to places like Illinois, Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. And he suggested that maybe we should do a reverse migration and go back to the South, to why assume our identity, but also to work in those spaces that need us. And so I thought that was a very interesting notion. Like, how can we, those of us who have migrated, what is our response to those people in those spaces where we may call home or called home at one time, either directly or indirectly through our ancestors? I thought that it's an interesting thought. But I think that the reverse migration can be, in addition to the physical migration, I think there may be some ways that we can, again, bolster support for our sisters and brothers who are living and working in those spaces like Georgia and Florida and Texas.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Those were some novel ideas that we don't hear every day. So I appreciate you sharing that and giving us food for thought. And we'll have the final question to Harrison. What are your thoughts as far as you're specifically in a state that has banned DEI and has done it in different ways? So can you share how are you addressing this, and what are some of your thoughts as far as how to get back to a more level playing field?
Yeah, so in Georgia, they're just making some movement to place more restrictions on employees. But I'm at a private university, so it's a little bit different than my two colleagues here on the discussion panel with me. Life University is a private university, and we specialize in healthcare, chiropractic healthcare. And so we have a little bit more leeway. But what I am really happy about, at Life University, is that we are truly committed, to DEI and simply honoring the students, the faculty, and the staff, not only recognizing who they are, but creating systems and resources to make sure everybody is successful. We have a diverse student population, we have a diverse faculty population, and because our students go out, they are healthcare professionals, they have to meet certain criteria for state licensure. And right now, there is another movement that's a very positive. There are 14 states that require medical personnel to do implicit bias training in order to renew their license or get their license for the first time. I happen to do some of that training. And so we're obligated to ensure that our students can not only pass a licensing exam, but they can also do the continuing education that's provided and pass those courses as well. But at Life University, I'm happy that we have created those resources. We're honoring the students. We're practicing fairness, and I appreciate when I get calls from the departments, the academic departments, and we review some of their syllabi and the accrediting bodies. They're coming out with new standards, and now they're including some type of implicit bias training or DEI training. I'm happy to be involved in that. So we're actually putting the work in with our students because we want our students ready. They represent us. And when they graduate, we want them to go out there and be successful. And like Dwayne said, contribute back to the university. In addition, they're going to represent us and give us a positive impression to everybody who's out there. So we're continuing doing the work that I began when I started 2 years ago. And I'm happy that so far, no one's interfering with any of that at this private university. You're muted.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. No, I appreciate everything you said, Dr. Davis, and I just want to reinforce that at SIU, that's really what we're doing. We're just staying committed. Even though we have the law, it cannot tell us what our values are. It's the law, and it's also our values that we espouse. And so we are staying true. We're also continuing to make sure that people understand the realities of our student body and what we're facing here in the state of Illinois. And I think that that's what we can all do personally and professionally, and stay true to the work of a DEI leader, of a chief diversity officer. And so with that, again, I want to just personally give a round of applause so far for the way you all have responded to these questions. They were a bit challenging, and I know that we are in states that some are vulnerable or on that way, but I really appreciate the candor and just the excellent insights that you all have shared to date. And now I'm going to go to our audience and thank you all for joining us and also persevering with us today. But I have a question that I would like to pose to our panelists. If we can share, we've talked a lot about the states that have banned DEI, but what are some examples of successful efforts that you have seen successfully prevent or repeal anti-DEI legislation? So I don't know if any of us are aware of that. We talked about 9 states have passed DEI legislation. Obviously more states have failed to do that. About 25 states have failed to do that. So if we could talk about how they were successful, if any of us have that knowledge or information.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. I just add some more information to it. When you can prove how your DEI efforts and the resources are actually working to improve retention and graduation rates, and how it's enriching the educational environment, for all the students. If we can own that narrative and actually show the data, that would be great. And that's what I have seen some colleagues have actually done. And we live in a data-driven society and workplace, and showing that data, of how successful these students of color are when they come to the university, and we have some resources set up for them, and then they are able to help recruit an even more diverse student population. Show the data, show how your efforts are successful with the bottom line, and those climate surveys are very important. That we distribute out to students in particular, and discovering from them what they're getting out of the DEI efforts, and exposing some of the students to more diversity is very helpful. They are desiring that information. They want to learn about different cultures, but now we have a different group of people making decisions that's affecting the educational experience for some of our students, and they're not realizing how it's hampering their process. But if we can just show the data, including the climate survey data, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. Excellent.
And can I just piggyback on Dr. Davis's statement about data? Because I think that there's often an assumption that if a student drops out, it's because of academics. Certainly that's sometimes the case. But in looking at our data here at the system office, we found that for far too many of our students, it's not academics. It's those other things, the sense of belonging, or an emergency that they didn't know how to sort of, navigate. So it's not necessarily about the academics. It's really about that whole experience of the student, and really understanding that we need to be present as institutions in different ways for our students than we have traditionally been or not been, if as it were. So I think that that's another aspect as we look at, thinking about data, and we do a lot of data here at the system office, of course, but really understanding like how to interpret that data, and how do you actually sort of dig deeper into the data. Data breeds more data. So, and so the idea is to really get down to why students are progressing or not progressing as they had intended when they enrolled in that institution. Because at one point, they all thought they had the intention of actually walk across that stage and getting that degree from shaking the hand of the president. And so I think that that's a part of it too, really understanding the complexity of why students choose or not, or it's chosen for them not to carry on.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And then again, we do have to be armed with that data. Andrea, were you going to make a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to also expound a little bit about the power of partnerships. I think when you think about the ability for, as was talked about earlier, the importance of the workforce component of this is something that we really have leveled up here in the state of Minnesota, and understanding that the public-private partnership can be a very powerful tool in a lot of different ways, including in the equity space. And understanding that when it comes down to who's coming in your workforce, to your point about statistics, the demographic statistics don't lie either, that we are in a space where we are a more diverse, more Black and brown country, and people have to understand that if you want a workforce that's going to be vibrant, and you're going to try to continue to live in a certain way, in terms of you have to bring forth everybody in order to have a vibrant and important workforce. That's one of the things that I found that speaks across a wide variety of different continuums of this work. And so when you think about that, and then bringing that forth with respect to how it affects the bottom line, quite frankly, for not just us as institutions, but for those that are private employers or public employers in terms of workforce. There's no question about it that we have to have a vibrant workforce for us to have a vibrant economy. And sometimes you have to go into that space and understand, help to understand, and really, I would say, counteract the perspective that this has no effect on a person's or a community's economy, because that is the reality of it. And I just as an example, one of our presidents who is African American is working presidents of a community college. She works in a very not very conservative, but I would say moderately conservative area. And she was able to really hone in with her business partners on the importance of diversity, equity, and to take a look around you in the small city that she works in, and to see the changing demographic. And if you want to continue to have a vibrant community, you have to take not just take advantage, but understand who's coming into your community, who's going to be that worker, who's going to be that entrepreneur. And she was really able to successfully bring along what I would consider to be probably people that hadn't really been in this space, hadn't thought about the effects of what equity and diversity and inclusion could mean to their small community, to their small company, and be successful. And I use that as an example of helping us to understand the broader effects of how this work could actually be counteractive when we bring along different partners in the space as well.
Excellent, thank you. I would like to even put a name to what you're describing. It's a term called trans-universalism, and it's when you take an issue and you make it universal. And I think that's really important, because if people sometimes just see that this is just an issue that's affecting Black and brown people, and we have to be honest, everybody got their issues and problems. We have a migrant issue, we have a refugee issue that's going on. And so it's like, unless we can make this issue relevant to other groups, again, it's not going to get that type of traction. Also, the last thing I'll say, based on the question that we asked, how are those states successful in getting the legislation repealed, is because many of them actually talked to their legislators. There was states that showed up in Groves who was like, hey, we do not want this ban going on. And again, they were able to use the data to talk about how the value of DEI in higher education, as well as in the greater society. And so I think that's something that everybody could do in states that even have not banned the legislation, is to make sure that the people who we vote for, who represent us in office, that they know what our convictions and our commitment is to DEI. I think that's something that everybody can do to counteract what we see as a trend now in society. I have one more question as I think about the time, that this will also be posed to the panelists, and this also may be relevant as well to Dr. Mahoney and I. How can SIU, Carbondale, as well as our Edwardsville campus, leverage our position as a school in the state that because we are comparably less under attack than other states, how will it affect faculty recruitment, policy development, student recruiting across state lines? So those are the questions. But I welcome other panelists to join in, but I might start with Dr. Mahoney to see what his thoughts are about that particular question.
Yeah, no, and I think Dwayne hit on this a little bit on some of the things we're doing in Maryland, and so in some ways it's fairly similar in that there is an opportunity, and I've talked with enough faculty and frankly administrators and some of those states under attack, and some of them say, I'm not going anywhere, I'm staying here and fighting, and I certainly respect that and support them as much as we can. But there's also some who say, I need to get out, and they're very talented individuals. So we have an opportunity to really improve the quality of every search pool that we have right now because of the environment, and we certainly would be foolish not to take advantage of that. I'm not seeing it affecting student recruitment as much yet, but that may change, I think, over time as students become more aware of this. But I think one of the things I would say is that I think, and I've said this several times, that because we are where we are, we have an opportunity to do things that other places, frankly, can't do right now. And there's a certain obligation in my mind that goes along with that to do those things, to create those models, back to Dr. Davis's point, that have the data that other states could later use. Because I still believe that ultimately, again, it's we're in a long fight. This is a bad period for some places, but things will change again. And if we at that point have created some models that states, once they become more open again to DEI, which I do believe will happen in the future, I have often said the students, the Gen Z group that is in our schools now, they will someday be the leaders. And I see them changing kind of what is happening now. And if we've created some models that other universities across the country can use, then I think that is something we should be focused on as well. So we're not just doing things good for SIU, but we're doing things ultimately that will be good for higher education 20 years from now or whenever that happens.
Absolutely. And one of the things I want to add with that, and again, I think it is important that we have leaders who talk about this as well. And so that's why it's really important to have Dr. Mahoney as our SIU president and chancellors and presidents across the state. But one of the things I want to speak specifically to faculty about is that as we talk about how many of these states have basically dismantled their DEI offices, we know that we have the data to show that invisible labor is an issue. So typically, students are going to DEI offices and basically sharing about their experiences, also getting strategies on how to navigate the environment. We talk about data. There is a particular data piece that has just come out that 40% of marginalized students, Black and brown students in higher ed, do not feel like their professors believe in them. Who are they going to go talk to about that if the DEI offices are now dismantled? So now you look at a lot of universities that do not have a critical mass of diverse faculty. So now those faculty who are there who are already burdened are going to be burdened even more. So I would also encourage people to start tracking that data, collect your own data about maybe I was talking to 10 students a week, now I'm talking to 50 students a week, because that additional resource that was in the university or the college setting is no longer there. And now I'm being burdened, and that burden may not be shared by your other colleagues because students want to talk to people who can understand their lived experience in a more expeditious manner, so I think that that's something else that we need to really to keep track of. But, I also want to say that Dr. Mahoney and I are on the Public Funding Commission, and we're actually talking about equity there. So in the spaces that we are occupying, we are definitely advocating still for equity and really speaking to our commitment. We have not wavered on our commitment. We are a system that has declared ourselves to be anti-racist, and that's one of the few in the whole nation. And so even with the legislation, we haven't backed down on any of that, and we will not. So I want to say that's how we're leveraging and handling that, is we're staying the course and we're showing our commitment to these efforts. Okay. So
yeah, I've told her this many times. She has my favorite title ever. It is the perfect title. It's like, oh, wow.
We don't have to wonder what you do.
Right.
Yeah, that could be another strategy. We all change our titles, right? We'll do that as well. That's something that we actually did at SIU. All of the leaders now have the anti-racism in their titles as chancellors, vice chancellors. Work.
Wonderful.
So,
awesome.
I'm not the only one, which I'm glad that we're all
committed
to solidarity.
No, that's a great point. I mean, the fact is, if you're truly going on this journey together, then it should be part of everyone's title, everyone's responsibility. And so I applaud you all. I applaud the leadership for just having the forethought to do this, because names matter. What we call things matter. And so kudos to you. And I hope that you will at some point write that up in some sort of academic journal, because that way it becomes real for everyone else.
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate that. And I actually want to give credit to the late and great Dr. Wesley McNeese. That was actually his idea, along with Dr. Mahoney, to actually make sure the word anti-racism was in the title. So and that was also, I just want to reinforce, Dwayne, that's what attracted me as well, is that it was very clear what the commitment was. And so I'm happy that just hasn't been a title, that's actually, again, I'm free to live in that space and do the work, because we do know that people will give you titles and not necessarily want to see you do the work. And so I'm very grateful that that's not the case, that it's aligned, right? It's a strong alignment there.
And if I can just add real quickly, maybe one of the things that we need to see happen is some more uniform standards with chief diversity officers at colleges and universities. We can just start with the title. You know, as Sheila and Andriel, you know, many of our colleagues, we have different titles and they don't always mean the same thing. So perhaps we can put that as a strategy out there to make sure we're all headed in the same direction, on the same path, using the same terms and having the same title. You know, I think that would be important too, as we try to confront some of these issues that we're facing.
Oh, yeah,
I would also double down to also say not just the title, but the positionality and the resources that
and
are
who you report to.
Yep. That work, because to your point, we have a lot of there seems to be a fluctuation across it's still, even with as long as this profession has really kind of, I would say, grown over the last 25, 30 years, there's still to Harrison's point, a variety on the continuum in terms of the ability to really be in a position to effectuate the work and effectuate the change in a way that's going to really be a true change catalyst within their organization. So I agree with you and wholeheartedly. And one of the things that we're working here is to try to coalesce some very basic standards around what's going to make us a better system from an equity standpoint. And one of those areas is we're still fighting it a little bit, has been around the question of where is the position of your chief or campus diversity officer. Titles do matter as well, and positionality matters as well. And they cannot be the only ones on your campus that are trying to move the dial with respect to this very, very important work. So yeah, lots more to do, lots more work to do.
And I think it's important to say that even as we talk about that in the states that have not been banned, you know, that's one of the main things that have changed in places like Texas, Florida. You know, it's culture, it's like executive director of culture and belonging. And so even those terms, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, have been banned. And another thing that we can also do is we talk about, many of us have talked about the narrative. Our NADAHE president, Paulette Granberry, who is also an attorney, has been very clear about us using the exact words and not just the acronym DEI. And so you've heard me be very deliberate in mentioning diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, that's another narrative that we need to recapture, right? And not just use the acronym, because I'm gonna give you an example. Specifically in Texas, they were using the term diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then when they modified their legislation, they just used DEI. Again, as we talk about not being clear, that was another way that they were able to be nefarious, I would say, and just kind of make it vague. So I think we need to also use the actual words as much as possible, and not also resort to acronyms as well. So I think that's another strategy that we need to be clear about. So we are actually approaching time. This has been just a rich and meaningful panel. I learned a lot, and so I'm very grateful that you all have joined us today and lended your expertise. I also want to thank our team members who have joined us on our YouTube channel. Again, this will be uploaded within 10 minutes after this session today. And again, I'm going to give you back your minute. And I also want to say enjoy the holidays, and please make sure you return in February, when we will have our next conversation of understanding, and we'll be engaging students on that panel to specifically have them tell us, we will learn from them about what will help them be successful as we talk about retention and graduation rates. So please join us for that conversation, and I want to wish everyone a happy holiday.